When I first bought my home, it wasn't some fancy mansion or sprawling estate, just a quiet, charming craftsman tucked away on Oakdale Lane, built in 1922 and full of creaky floors, crooked charm, and history. I didn't buy it for the curb appeal. I bought it because it reminded me of my grandfather's house. It had character, soul, and the kind of weathered beauty you don't find in modern, cookie-cutter homes. The kind of house that creaks at night, not because it's falling apart, but because it's alive. The neighborhood was part of a historic district, something I'd been told but never truly thought would affect me. I paid my dues, mowed the lawn, kept the flower beds neat. The HOA, called the Oakdale Preservation Society, was mostly hands-off, or so I thought. Most of the time they just sent out newsletters and tried to organize neighborhood barbecues no one really attended. That is, until Karen Duvall became president. Karen had the air of someone who had never been told no in her life. Platinum blonde bob, tennis skirts even in winter, and a clipboard that looked permanently glued to her hand. She had recently retired from her job in interior design, which really meant she redesigned her own house 10 times and now wanted to control everyone else's. Within a month of her reign, she'd proposed new rules about what color door paint was historically accurate, tried to ban solar panels, and started knocking on doors unannounced for compliance checks. Still, I mostly ignored her until I got a letter marked urgent, historic preservation action required. At first, I assumed it was just another one of Karen's silly flyers, but when I opened it, I nearly choked on my coffee. Dear resident, congratulations. After a thorough review, your property at 109 Oakdale Lane has been declared a historic public landmark by the Oakdale Preservation Society. Effective immediately, your home will be listed in the Community Heritage Directory. As part of our new initiative, the public may request access to your home's exterior and limited interior during designated times to promote historical appreciation. Wait, what? They wanted to turn my home into a museum exhibit? I kept reading. Buried in legalese was the kicker. By being listed, I was now required to maintain the house's authentic historical integrity, meaning no renovations without HOA approval, and I could be fined for removing historical elements like the original windows, floorboards, or even the antique mailbox. And the kicker? They were planning to hold monthly walking tours that would include my yard and front porch as a stop. If I didn't comply, fines up to $5,000 per violation. I stormed down to the HOA office, which was just a fancy name for a small room attached to the community clubhouse. Karen was there, wearing a pastel cardigan and sipping something out of a monogrammed mug. "Ah, Mr. Brooks," she said, not even looking up. "Did you receive our exciting announcement?" "Exciting?" I said, waving the letter in front of her face. "You just turned my house into a tourist trap without even asking me." Karen set down her mug and clasped her hands like a kindergarten teacher explaining nap time. "It's not a tourist trap. It's a contribution to the neighborhood's rich cultural identity. Your house is one of the oldest structures on Oakdale. It's a privilege to be recognized." "Recognized? You're scheduling tours to walk through my garden. You want me to get approval to change my curtains." She gave a tight smile. "Historical accuracy matters. It's about preservation." I leaned forward. "And what about compensation? If people are walking on my property and taking pictures, am I being paid?" Karen's smile faltered. "Well, no, of course not. This is about civic pride, not profit." Of course it was. That's when I realized. This wasn't just about history. It was about control. Karen saw my house as her latest trophy. Something she could show off, brag about, and micromanage into oblivion. And I wasn't going to let that happen. If she wanted to play games with rules and red tape, she'd better buckle up, because she was about to find out I wasn't just some homeowner. I was an architectural designer by trade. I knew building codes, I knew easement laws, and, most importantly, I had a plan. I started by doing some digging into the HOA charter, into county historical designation law, into zoning policies. And that's when I discovered something deliciously ironic. While the HOA could suggest historical status, the actual legal designation had to go through the County Planning Commission, not just a homeowners association. And guess what? The county had no record of my property being submitted for historical protection. Karen's letter was a bluff, a paper tiger. But she didn't stop there. The next week, I came home to find a group of people standing on my lawn with brochures, pointing at my porch and chatting loudly. A woman in a floppy sun hat was telling a child, "This is the original door, nearly 100 years old." I walked up, arms crossed. "Excuse me, can I help you?" The woman looked startled. "Oh, we're part of the Oakdale Historic Homes Tour." "Are you now? And who gave you permission to be on my property?" She blinked. "Well, the HOA. They said this was part of the community trail." I stared at them, then pulled out my phone. "You've got about 10 seconds to leave before I start charging admission." The crowd shuffled awkwardly and dispersed. That night, I filed a cease and desist with the HOA, and I posted a new sign in my front yard the next morning. "Welcome to the Oakdale Historical Experience. Tour times, by appointment only. Admission, $25 per person, cash or Venmo. Unauthorized entry will be considered trespassing. The management." Mark, my neighbor across the street, nearly choked on his bagel when he saw it. "Brooks," he called out, grinning, "are you charging people to look at your porch now?" "Damn right I am," I said. "If they want a tour, they're going to pay for it." And people did. The sign went viral on local Facebook groups. I even made laminated badges that said Certified Oakdale Landmark Visitor. Half as a joke, half as a way to keep Karen guessing. She had turned my home into a spectacle, so I leaned in and turned it into a business. The thing about HOA Karens like Karen Duvall is that they're used to playing offense. They love being the ones issuing warnings, doling out fines, and writing snide little emails about community standards. But the moment you turn the tables, they unravel. Fast. My little stunt with the sign made waves. The next HOA newsletter had an entire section titled Misuse of Historical Designation for Personal Profit. Karen didn't mention me by name, but it didn't take a genius to read between the lines. She was trying to paint me as some grifter, exploiting the neighborhood's heritage for money. But here's the thing. She was the one who started it. She was the one who declared my home a public attraction without my consent. All I did was start charging for the show she created. And the neighborhood? Oh, they loved it. People stopped by just to laugh at the sign. A few neighbors even offered to help run tours. Mark across the street made T-shirts that said Official Oakdale Landmark Staff and started wearing them while mowing his lawn. It was satire at its finest, and Karen couldn't stand it. So, she escalated. One afternoon, I came home to a bright orange violation notice taped to my front door. I tore it down and read it, already knowing whose fingerprints were all over it. Sure enough, it was signed by Karen Duvall herself. Violation, unauthorized commercial activity, fine $1,000. Notes: running an unapproved business on residential property is a breach of HOA bylaws. Immediate compliance required. I laughed so hard I had to sit down. This was getting ridiculous. I wasn't actually running a business. I wasn't making flyers, there were no business hours, and I sure as hell wasn't collecting tax. The whole thing was a joke, but to Karen, it was a threat to her control, and she didn't realize she was walking directly into the trap I was setting for her. Because the second she fined me for commercial activity, she gave me a legal foothold. See, I had already spoken to a friend of mine who's a zoning attorney. He told me something very interesting. If the HOA was formally accusing me of running a business, they had to report that to the county for compliance. And the county? Well, they don't like it when HOAs start inventing businesses that don't exist. It clogs up their paperwork and wastes their time. So I called the county office. "Hi," I said, doing my best confused citizen voice. "I just received a fine for running an unlicensed business out of my home, and I wanted to make sure I'm in compliance." The woman on the line sounded surprised. What kind of business are you running? None, I said. But my HOA president says I'm charging people to look at my porch. There was a pause. Sir? What? Exactly. She transferred me to a zoning compliance officer who, after hearing the full story, practically snorted into the phone. You're telling me your HOA fined you for being popular? That's one way to put it. He chuckled. Well, sir, you're not in violation of any zoning laws, and unless you're selling tickets or operating during business hours, this doesn't qualify as commercial use. But I'll tell you what, I'll go ahead and file a formal review just to be safe. I thanked him and hung up. Then I printed the email he sent me, a clean, official note stating that I was not in violation of any business ordinances, and taped it to my door right where the violation notice had been. And under it, I added a handwritten sign, "Nice try, Karen." 3 days later, the HOA rescinded the fine, but Karen wasn't done. Next, she filed a noise complaint, claiming that the so-called tours were disturbing the peace. Now, mind you, the tours were just people walking past my house and occasionally chuckling at the sign. No loud music, no megaphones, just mild neighborhood buzz. Still, a police officer showed up. He was polite, clearly just doing his job, but I could tell he was skeptical from the start. "Sir," he said, "we received a report of excessive noise and foot traffic at this address. Mind if I take a quick look?" I waved him in. "Be my guest." He did a quick walk around the yard, noted the quiet, and scratched his head. "This is what they called about?" "Yep," I said. "Apparently I'm disrupting the sanctity of the street with historical facts and sarcasm." He smirked. "Look, off the record, I think your sign is hilarious, but I have to write up a report anyway." "Understood," I said. "Mind if I take a picture with you next to the sign? You'd be the 5th officer this week." He laughed and declined, but before leaving he said, "You know, if they keep calling in false complaints, that can be considered harassment, especially if it's targeting you." I nodded slowly. That was exactly what I needed. The more Karen pushed, the more ammo she handed me. She had overplayed her hand. So I decided to go on the offensive. The next week, I held an open house, but not the kind Karen was expecting. I put up flyers for Oakdale's first and only sarcastic landmark tour. For a $10 suggested donation, visitors could join me for a guided walkthrough of approved architectural sarcasm and enjoy complimentary lemonade and historic gossip from the porch. It was half joke, half roast, and fully legal. Over 30 people showed up. One woman brought a folding chair and stayed for 2 hours. Mark ran a fake gift shop out of his garage and sold mugs that said, "Karen can't stop this tour." We even had a tip jar with a little sign that read, "HOA Fines Fund. Keep the dream alive." The pictures went viral online, and that's when the media caught wind. A local news station showed up the following weekend, curious about the guy charging admission to his own front porch. They interviewed me live, asked about the HOA's antics, and gave me the perfect platform to tell the world about the overreach happening in Oakdale Estates. The segment aired that night. Karen must have been watching, because the very next morning I received an email from the HOA labeled, "Urgent. Cease unapproved media engagements." I printed that too, and pinned it next to the Karen's scoreboard I had started on my fence. Karen, 0. Me, 5. The tide was turning, and Karen? She was spiraling. The news piece did exactly what I hoped it would, shine a massive spotlight on Karen's little HOA kingdom. Suddenly, my house wasn't just a running joke in the neighborhood. It was a symbol. Of what exactly? Well, that depended on who you asked. For some, it was about standing up to petty power. For others, it was just good old-fashioned entertainment. But for Karen, it was a direct threat to everything she had tried to build. The very next HOA meeting was packed to the walls. I showed up, naturally, wearing a t-shirt that said "Tour Guide" across the front and carrying a binder full of receipts, real and metaphorical. Karen was already seated at the head of the table, lips pursed so tight she looked like she was holding in a sneeze. She didn't even acknowledge me as I sat down. Mr. Benson, one of the newer board members and a surprisingly reasonable guy, cleared his throat. "We're here to discuss the recent publicity surrounding Mr. Walker's residence and whether it constitutes a violation of the HOA bylaws." I raised a hand casually. I'd be happy to help clarify, since I'm apparently the star of this particular circus. Karen's eyes snapped to me, and her voice dripped with disdain as she said, "Mr. Walker, this is a formal meeting. You don't get to grandstand here." I smiled. "Of course, Karen. I'll keep the grandstanding to the front lawn." The room chuckled. Karen did not. Another board member, Linda something or other, flipped through some papers. "Mr. Walker, it says here you've been charging people to visit your home. Is that accurate?" I nodded. "Suggested donations only, and more importantly, it was in response to the HOA publicly designating my property a historic landmark without my permission or any legal authority." Karen cut in sharply. "We merely celebrated the home's unique style. We never officially—" "Karen," I interrupted, "you had it printed in the HOA newsletter. You mailed out flyers. You called it Oakdale's Architectural Gem, and you encouraged foot traffic to my property. Would you like me to bring copies? I've got them in the car." Benson leaned forward. "Is that true?" Karen faltered. "We were promoting neighborhood pride." I didn't miss a beat. "Great. Then you can understand why I embraced the attention. You lit the fire. I just sold marshmallows." That got a laugh from the crowd. What followed was an hour of back-and-forth debate, most of it veiled attempts by Karen to regain control of the narrative. She tried painting me as disruptive, as someone abusing the system. But the truth was, more and more neighbors were on my side. Even some of the older residents, who normally kept to themselves, had started showing up to the landmark tours just to spite her. After the meeting, Benson pulled me aside. "Look," he said quietly, "you're not in the wrong here. But Karen isn't going to stop. She's going to keep escalating this." I nodded. "That's what I'm counting on." He raised an eyebrow. "You've got a plan?" "Oh," I said with a grin, "I've got the plan. Because here's what Karen didn't know. While she was busy trying to fine me into submission, I had been doing some digging of my own. See, the HOA had been operating under a very old set of bylaws, ones that hadn't been properly updated in over a decade. And buried deep in those bylaws was a provision that allowed for a vote of no confidence in the board, provided enough members signed a petition. The magic number? 40% of households. It wouldn't be easy, but with Karen torching her reputation left and right, the timing was perfect. All I needed to do was show the neighborhood that they had power, and that it was time to take it back. I spent the next 2 weeks going door to door, clipboard in hand, explaining everything. The fake landmark status, the false violation notices, the misuse of HOA funds for Karen's personal pet projects. People were furious, and more importantly, they were eager to sign. "About time someone stood up to her," old Mr. Dupree muttered as he scrawled his name across the petition. "She fined me $200 for leaving my Christmas lights up a day too long," said the Thompsons. "We're in." Even Mark, who already had the t-shirt business going full steam, started including little flyers about the petition in every order. By the end of the second week, I had the signatures I needed, and then some. I submitted the petition during the next board meeting. Karen didn't even try to hide her panic when she saw the stack of papers. "What is this?" she asked, flipping through the pages with shaking hands. "That," I said, "is your official notice. We're calling for a vote to remove the current board and elect new members. Per the bylaws, the ones you forgot to update, it's perfectly legal." She sputtered. "This is an ambush." I leaned forward. "No, Karen. This is accountability." It took a few days to organize the vote, but when it finally happened, the turnout was massive. People who hadn't attended an HOA meeting in years came out just to cast their vote. And when the final tally was read aloud, it was a landslide. Karen and her cronies were officially out. The room erupted in applause. Karen stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing like she wanted to argue but couldn't find the words. She stormed out without saying another word, her heels clicking furiously against the tile. Just like that, The era of Karen was over. But I wasn't done, because it wasn't enough to remove her from the board. I wanted to make sure no one ever abused the HOA's power like that again. So I worked with the new board, led by none other than Benson, to revise the bylaws. We added safeguards against abuse, transparency requirements for spending, and, most importantly, a rule that no home could be labeled a community landmark without the owner's written permission. They named it Walker's Rule. I pretended to be embarrassed, but honestly, I loved it. Later that week, as I was pulling weeds in the yard, Mark walked over, drink in hand. "Dude," he said, "you actually did it." I nodded. "Wasn't just me, the whole neighborhood was ready. They just needed someone to light the fuse." He raised his glass. "To the guy who charged Karen rent for her own drama." I laughed. "To us. And may Karen never return." But of course I wasn't that lucky, because as it turns out, Karen wasn't done yet. The next few days were chaos. Karen had clearly underestimated how fast news spread in our little town, especially when it involved drama, the HOA, and someone finally standing up to them. I hadn't even posted the signs for 24 hours before curious neighbors started knocking on my door asking if the public tours were real. At first, I thought they were joking. But then one lady handed me $20 and asked if she could walk through the landmark and take pictures for her blog. That's when the idea really took shape. If they wanted to call my home a landmark, then fine, they were going to get exactly what they asked for, down to the last historical plaque and velvet rope. By the end of the week, I had turned my house into a full-blown tourist attraction. I created a fake backstory, completely over the top and ridiculous. According to the brochure I whipped up on my home printer, my house had once been a hideout for 19th century bootleggers, and the floorboards still carried the whispers of the underground resistance. I even taped a fake historical marker to the mailbox. McAllister Residence, Est, 1859, home of revolution, spice, and spirit. I had people walking around in awe, snapping pictures of my laundry room and whispering reverently in the hallways like it was some ancient temple. I charged $10 for entry and an extra $5 for a guided tour, which of course was me spinning the most ridiculous stories you could imagine. Karen nearly had a stroke when she saw a line of tourists down the sidewalk. She came marching up, clipboard in hand, practically foaming at the mouth. "You can't do this," she shouted, waving her papers like they were holy scripture. I smiled and gestured to the plaque nailed into the lawn. According to the HOA's own filing, this is now a public landmark. Public means public, unless of course you're saying the HOA made a mistake. That shut her up for the moment, but I knew she wasn't going to let it go that easily. Sure enough, 2 days later, I got another letter this time from the HOA's legal consultant. It was a cease and desist order, claiming I was commercializing a property within a residential zone. I laughed so hard I nearly choked on my coffee. First, they forced my home to be declared a public site. Now they were mad that I was treating it like one. I decided to have a little fun with my response. I hand-delivered a letter back to the HOA office, complete with my lawyer's signature at the bottom. It read, "As per your official designation of my residence as a public landmark, my client has every legal right to engage in guided tours, educational exhibits, and community outreach programs. We look forward to working with the HOA to further develop this initiative." The next HOA meeting was packed. Karen was red-faced, pacing back and forth like a dictator in a crumbling regime. I walked in, cool as ever, carrying a box of branded merchandise I'd started selling at my little gift shop stand by the front door, mugs, magnets, even T-shirts that said, "I survived the McAllister Landmark Tour." The crowd loved it. One of the HOA board members, Mr. Henderson, actually laughed out loud when I pulled out a historic toilet tour badge and pinned it to my shirt. Karen banged her gavel like she was presiding over a courtroom. "This is a mockery of the HOA," she shrieked. "He's making a joke out of our bylaws." I leaned on the podium and grinned. No, Karen, I'm just taking your rules to their logical conclusion." The board was split. Half of them looked like they wanted to throttle me. The other half looked like they were desperately trying not to laugh. I saw one lady literally choke on her water when I suggested adding my house to the city's tourist map. But what could they do? They had voted unanimously to declare my home a public landmark. There was paperwork, there were records. Any attempt to undo it would require a vote from the entire HOA, and judging by the smirking faces around the room, that wasn't going to happen anytime soon. Karen was trapped in a bureaucratic net of her own making. What started as a petty power grab had turned into a full-on spectacle. News spread beyond the neighborhood. A local blogger wrote about the suburban landmark that fights back, and suddenly I had reporters emailing me asking if they could do features. One guy even asked if he could film a documentary on petty suburban warfare. I said yes, obviously. My home was now more than just a house. It was a symbol of rebellion, a middle finger to HOA tyranny. And as for Karen, every time she walked past my house, she did so with her head down, pretending not to notice the landmark tour in progress sign I hung from my mailbox. But I knew she saw it. She always saw it. As the weeks passed, my so-called landmark gained a bit of a cult following. Local influencers stopped by to take photos on the infamous front porch, tagging it with captions like #Landmark Rebellion and #HOA Who. My tours were booked nearly every weekend, and I even had a local bakery partner with me to sell historic house cookies shaped like little mailboxes and hedge trimmers. It was absurd, but it worked. What started as a prank had turned into a profitable side hustle. I wasn't just fighting back anymore. I was thriving, and that drove Karen completely mad. Desperate to regain control, Karen did what she always did. She weaponized the rulebook. A new proposal landed on the next HOA meeting's agenda. Motion to revoke landmark status based on resident disruption and abuse of designation. It was so transparent, so blatantly personal, that even the HOA board members who usually sat silently were uncomfortable. "This motion," Karen hissed, "is to preserve the dignity of our neighborhood." I raised an eyebrow. "You mean the dignity that involves stealing people's land through forced declarations and then punishing them when they play along?" She glared at me like she wanted to throttle me right there at the table. The vote was closer than I liked. But in the end, the motion to revoke failed. One board member abstained, saying he needed more time to assess the community impact. Another, Mrs. Rios, voted against it entirely. "He's not breaking any rules," she said. "If we declared his home a landmark, we have to live with it." That was the final nail in the coffin for Karen's authority. From that moment on, people stopped listening to her. She lost the edge she used to have. The fear factor, the intimidation. Now, when she barked about violations or muttered threats, people just nodded, rolled their eyes, and went about their day. Still, Karen wasn't done. She stopped trying to beat me through official channels and started playing dirty. One morning, I found my mailbox ripped out of the ground, broken in 2 pieces on the sidewalk. Another time, someone, let's be honest, it was definitely her, dumped a bag of dead leaves across my porch with a passive-aggressive note that read, "Real landmarks are clean." I reported everything to the HOA, and, surprisingly, this time they actually took me seriously. I submitted the footage from my doorbell cam grainy, but clearly showing Karen in a hoodie doing her best impression of a petty criminal. The board voted to fine her for property damage. It was a small win, but it was another crack in her crumbling wall of control. Then came the best part. The city got wind of what was happening. Apparently, someone, probably one of my amused tour guests, submitted my fake historic brochure to the local preservation society. At first, I thought I was in trouble, but to my surprise, they reached out with genuine interest. "We'd love to come inspect the property," the rep said. "If it has cultural or historical value, we may be able to grant it official recognition." I nearly choked. You do realize the whole bootlegger hideout thing was a joke, right? But they didn't care. "If the community recognizes it as significant," the rep said, "that's enough to consider it." So they came. I gave them the same ridiculous tour I gave everyone else, except this time I played it totally straight. Here's the famous pantry where legend says the resistance stored their spiced preserves. The inspectors nodded thoughtfully, taking notes like I was revealing the location of a secret underground tunnel. Karen, who had been watching the whole thing unfold from her front porch, looked like she was about to burst a blood vessel. She marched across the street mid-tour and demanded to speak with the inspectors. "This house is not historic," she shouted. "He made all of it up." One of the inspectors calmly turned to her and said, "Ma'am, according to the HOA's own paperwork, this residence was officially designated a public landmark. We're simply honoring that status." That shut her up real quick. By the end of the visit, the inspectors handed me a packet of paperwork. "If you'd like to move forward," they said, "you can apply for official recognition from the city. It'll come with a small plaque and tax incentives." Tax incentives. That was all I needed to hear. I sent in the application the same day. Within a week, it was approved. My house, at the same one Karen had tried to control through HOA red tape, was now officially recognized by the city as a landmark. And now, any attempt to modify or rezone the property had to go through city council review. I made sure Karen received a copy of the certificate in the mail. I even included a thank you note. "Thanks for the idea," I wrote. "Couldn't have done it without your relentless, unnecessary aggression." She never responded, but she didn't have to. Her silence was the sweetest confirmation that I had won, completely, legally, publicly, and all with her own weapon of choice paperwork. By the time spring rolled around, my house wasn't just a home. It had become a full-blown community staple. Families brought their kids on weekend walks to take photos by the plaque. A local artist even painted a mural on the side of my garage depicting Landmark Lane, featuring my house with cartoon-style vines and gold trim. What started as a forced designation had become a symbol of neighborhood independence. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Karen had tried to force control over me, but all she did was hand me a platform, and I used it to flip the HOA's nonsense on its head. The best part? With the city's recognition, my property was now exempt from several HOA regulations. That meant no more fines about exterior color tones or unapproved decorative displays. I repainted my shutters bright red just to celebrate. Karen tried to raise hell at the next HOA meeting, claiming my house was now an eyesore that draws unwanted attention. Mr. Lancaster, who had grown increasingly tired of her antics, simply replied, "Then stop looking at it, Karen." The room laughed, and for the first time, Karen didn't have a comeback. She just sat there, lips pursed so tightly you could hear the tension hum in the air. Despite her bruised ego, Karen still found ways to meddle. She filed an anonymous complaint to the city about unauthorized business activity, referring to the little gift shop I had set up in my garage. I was selling mugs, magnets, and T-shirts with phrases like, "This landmark fights back," and "historic since Karen declared it so." The city inspected again and found nothing wrong. "You're within your rights," the inspector said, "and honestly, these shirts are hilarious." He bought one for his wife. Karen's complaint was denied. Again, I hung a new sign outside, "Tour plus T-shirt combo, $10. And that's when it really snowballed. The local news caught wind of the story. "Man turns forest landmark into business empire," the headline read. A news van pulled up on a sunny Tuesday morning, camera crew in tow. They interviewed me in front of my porch, while a crowd of curious neighbors gathered. I told the story start to finish, how I moved in, got steamrolled by an HOA agenda, then turned their own rules into a weapon. Karen refused to comment, of course, but Lancaster gave the news team a gem of a quote. "Sometimes you try to cage someone in, and instead, you build them a stage." It went viral. I was invited to speak at a local business conference the following month. With the spotlight came a flood of support. People from other neighborhoods reached out to ask how they could fight back against their own HOAs. I started a blog, Landmark Living, Outsmarting Your HOA. One rule at a time. It got traction fast. I posted templates, tips, and guides on how to legally resist HOA overreach. The feedback poured in stories from folks who'd been fined for the color of their door, for having a flagpole, for using drought-resistant plants instead of HOA-approved grass. They were angry, frustrated, and tired. And now, they had a roadmap. Karen had created a monster, and I was feeding it with every new blog post. Eventually, Karen gave up. Or, rather, she vanished. She stopped attending meetings. Her usual morning compliance patrols through the neighborhood ended. One day, a for sale sign appeared on her lawn. 2 weeks later, a moving truck pulled up, and just like that, she was gone. No goodbye, no closure, just a sour chapter closing on its own. I stood on my porch, coffee in hand, watching her load the last box into the truck. She caught my eye for a brief second. I gave her a small wave. She turned away, face burning with defeat. With Karen gone, the HOA relaxed. Not entirely rules were still in place, but the tyranny was over. Lancaster remained president, and under his leadership, things started to change. The HOA began focusing on real issues, fixing broken sidewalks, upgrading community lighting, hosting neighborhood events. I was even invited to speak at the annual HOA Town Hall. My topic: how to listen to your residents before they turn their homes into tourist attractions. The crowd loved it, and afterward, Lancaster shook my hand. "You've done more good here than you probably realize," he said. "Karen tried to make an example out of you, and instead, you made an example out of her." By the 1-year anniversary of my home's landmark status, I threw a block party. I called it the Freedom from HOA Overreach Festival. We had food trucks, live music, yard games, and a banner that read, "Historic because Karen said so." Neighbors danced in the street. Kids ran around with sticker badges that said, "Certified Landmark Explorer." Mark gave a speech about how the whole neighborhood had changed since I moved in. "He didn't just grow roots," he said. "He gave us permission to plant our own." I wasn't crying. The smoke from the BBQ just got in my eyes. As the sun set on the party, I looked out over the crowd, families laughing, friends sharing drinks, the whole street lit up with string lights. My house stood at the center of it all, not just a structure, but a symbol, a monument to resistance, creativity, and a little bit of petty genius. Karen tried to make me a cautionary tale. Instead, she made me a legend. And even though she was gone, I kept a little framed reminder on my mantel, my original HOA notice declaring my home a public landmark. Because in the end, Karen gave me the best gift she possibly could, the power to fight back and win.